The axe had slipped on a Tuesday. By Friday, Silas Whitfield was dead. Cora stood at the edge of the grave, her hands folded in front of her, her gray-green eyes fixed on the fresh mound of Kansas dirt that now held everything she had ever loved. The September wind moved across the prairie like a living thing, bending the tall grass in waves that rolled toward the horizon. It carried the smell of dying summer, the smell of change coming whether anyone wanted it or not. The minister was still talking. Reverend Bowen, with his black coat and his practiced sympathy, speaking words about resurrection and the life everlasting. Cora heard none of it. She was looking past the grave, past the small cluster of neighbors who had come to pay their respects past the edge of the settlement itself. She was looking at the woodpile. It sat behind their cabin 100 yards from where she stood, half finished, maybe 4 cords if she was generous with her counting. Silas had been working on it when the accident happened, building it up for winter the way he did every year, the way every man on the Kansas prairie did if he wanted his family to survive until spring. 4 cords, maybe 4.5. Winter in Kansas required 8, 10 if the cold came early and stayed late. Cora did the math in her head while the minister talked about heaven. She did the math while the neighbors murmured their amens. She did the math while the men picked up their shovels and began filling the grave, each thud of dirt on wood driving the numbers deeper into her mind. 4 cords, 3 months of real cold, a cabin with gaps in the logs that whistled when the north wind blew. The math did not work. The math said she would freeze to death sometime in January, maybe February if she was lucky. The math said she would join Silas in that cold ground before the first flowers of spring pushed through the snow. The math said she was already dead. She just hadn't stopped breathing yet. The infection had moved fast. Cora remembered every hour of those 3 days with a clarity that would never fade no matter how long she lived. She remembered the moment Silas had come in from the woodpile, his left hand wrapped in a rag that was already soaking through with blood. Just a slip, he had said. The axe caught the edge of my palm. Nothing to worry about. She had cleaned the wound herself, poured whiskey over it the way her mother had taught her, wrapped it in clean cloth, told him to rest though she knew he wouldn't. There was wood to cut. Winter was coming. A man did not rest when winter was coming. The next morning, the skin around the cut had turned red. By evening, the red had spread up his wrist. By the following dawn, his arm was swollen and hot to the touch, and Silas was shivering despite the warmth of the cabin. The fever came fast after that. It grabbed hold of him and would not let go. Cora had tried everything she knew. Cold compresses, willow bark tea, prayers to a God she was no longer certain was listening. The doctor came from town on the second day. He looked at the arm, at the black streaks running up toward Silas's shoulder, and his face told Cora everything his words would not. Blood poisoning, he said. There's nothing I can do. I'm sorry. Silas died on the morning of the 3rd day. He was 31 years old. They had been married for 4 years. They had no children, though not for lack of trying. They had a cabin, 160 acres of prairie land, and a dream of building something that would last. Now Cora had a grave, half a woodpile, and a piece of paper that said she had until spring to prove up the claim or lose everything. The neighbors left one by one. They offered their condolences as they went. The men shook Cora's hand with the awkward formality of people who did not know what to say. The women embraced her, some with genuine sympathy, others with the kind of pity that was really satisfaction wearing a mask. One by one they climbed into their wagons and rode away, until only Harriet Bowen remained. The minister's wife was a woman in her middle 50s with steel-rimmed spectacles and a spine that seemed incapable of bending. She stood beside the grave in her black dress, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes fixed on Cora with an expression that might have been concern if it had contained any warmth. Mrs. Whitfield, she said, I wonder if I might have a word. Cora did not want a word. She wanted to be alone. She wanted to walk back to the cabin that still smelled like Silas, to lie down in the bed they had shared, to close her eyes and not open them until the world made sense again. But she had been raised to be polite, even now, even in this. Of course, Mrs. Bowen. Harriet stepped closer. The wind caught the edge of her bonnet, but she ignored it. Her attention was entirely focused on the young widow in front of her. Several of us have been talking, she said. The women of the auxiliary. We're concerned about your situation. My situation. You're alone now, a woman alone with winter coming. No family in the territory, no means of support. She adjusted her spectacles, the gesture somehow managing to convey both sympathy and judgment. We want to help. Cora felt something stir in her chest, something that was not grief, something harder, more dangerous. Help, she repeated. My husband knows a widower in Dodge City, a respectable man, a merchant. He's looking for a wife, someone to help raise his children. I could write to him on your behalf, make introductions. Harriet's voice softened, or tried to. It's not a shameful thing, Mrs. Whitfield. To seek a new husband when the old one has passed, it's practical. It's what widows do. Cora looked at the woman in front of her, at the spectacles that magnified her eyes, at the thin line of her mouth, at the certainty that radiated from her like heat from a stove. Thank you for your concern, Cora said. The words came out flat and cold, each one a stone dropped into still water. But I'm not interested in a husband. I'm interested in surviving the winter. You won't survive the winter alone, Yishiga, Harriet's voice sharpened. You have half a woodpile. Half. Do you know what happens to women who try to make it through a Kansas winter with half a woodpile and no man to help them? I imagine I'll find out. You'll freeze. You'll starve. You'll come crawling to town by Christmas begging for charity, and by then it will be too late for anyone to help you. Harriet shook her head, her spectacles catching the afternoon light. I'm trying to save your life, Mrs. Whitfield. The least you could do is listen. Cora turned away from the grave, away from Harriet, away from the settlement and the people in it, and the entire world that seemed determined to tell her what she could and could not do. The least you could do, she said, is leave me alone. She walked back to the cabin without looking back. She heard Harriet calling after her, something about pride and foolishness in the women's auxiliary, but she did not stop. She did not turn. She kept walking until she reached the door of the cabin, and then she went inside and closed it behind her. The silence wrapped around her like a blanket. She stood in the middle of the room, looking at the space that had been her home for 4 years. The bed where Silas had slept. The chair where he sat in the evenings carving small figures from scrap wood. The stove that he had bought with his own money, hauled all the way from Wichita on the back of a borrowed wagon. Everything in this room carried his fingerprints, his memory, his absence. Cora sat down in his chair. She did not cry. She had cried enough over the past 3 days. There were no tears left in her, only a hollow space where they used to be, a space that was slowly filling with something else. Determination, maybe, or desperation. Perhaps there was no difference between the two. The women's auxiliary met on Thursday afternoons in the back room of the general store. Cora was not there, of course. She had never been a member of the auxiliary, never been interested in the quilting circles, in the charity drives, and the endless gossip that passed for Christian fellowship in a settlement this small. But she knew the auxiliary existed. Everyone did. It was the social engine that drove the settlement, the place where reputations were made and destroyed, where alliances formed and dissolved, where the future of every family in 50 miles was discussed and debated over tea and needlework. She did not need to be there to know what they were saying about her. Word traveled fast in a settlement this small. By Friday morning, everyone knew that the auxiliary had discussed Mrs. Whitfield's situation. By Friday afternoon, everyone knew what they had decided. The widow would fail. It was only a matter of time. She had no husband, no family, no way to cut the wood she needed or repair the cabin that would crumble around her as the winter wore on. She was young and stubborn and foolish, refusing to accept the help that had been offered, refusing to do what widows were supposed to do when they found themselves alone. The settlement would wait. They would watch. And when she finally broke, when she finally came crawling into town with her pride in pieces, they would be there to say they had told her so. Cora heard the whispers. She saw the looks. She felt the weight of all those expectations pressing down on her like snow on a roof. She ignored them. There was work to do. The first week after Silas died, Cora did nothing but survive. She woke each morning before dawn when the cabin was cold and the fire had burned down to coals. She rebuilt the fire, cooked whatever food she had, and ate standing up because sitting down felt too much like giving up. She tended the chickens that Silas had built a coop for, collected the eggs, and counted them like coins because they were currency now. Everything was currency now. Every piece of food, every stick of firewood, every hour of daylight that could be used for work. She tried cutting wood herself on the third day. The axe was heavy in her hands, heavier than she had expected. Silas had made it look easy the way he made everything look easy. The steady rhythm of his swing, the clean bite of the blade into wood, the satisfying crack as each log split in two. Cora swung. The axe bounced off the log, nearly taking her knee with it. She swung again. This time the blade caught, but at an angle, wedging itself into the wood without splitting it. She worked for 2 hours. At the end of those 2 hours, she had half a cord of badly split wood and blisters on both palms. That would take a week to heal. Half a cord, 2 hours. She did the math again. 8 cords to survive the winter. If she could cut half a cord every 2 hours, and if she worked 8 hours a day, she could cut 2 cords a day. 4 days to cut the 8 cords she needed. Except she couldn't work 8 hours a day. Not with everything else that needed doing. Not with the chickens and the cooking and the repairs to the cabin and the 100 other tasks that kept a homestead running. Not with hands that were already bleeding blisters that would become open wounds if she kept swinging that axe. And even if she could cut the wood, she would have to burn it all. Every stick, every log, because cutting wood was just the first problem. The real problem was the cabin itself. Cora stood in the doorway that evening, watching the sun set over the prairie, and felt the wind coming through the gaps in the logs. She put her hand against the wall and felt the cold bleeding through the timber, even now, even in September. By January, that cold would be a living thing. It would crawl through every crack, every gap, every imperfection in the chinking. It would steal the heat from her fire faster than she could produce it. She could burn 10 cords, 20 cords, and still freeze to death. Because the problem wasn't firewood. The problem was physics. Cora went to town on Saturday. She had put it off as long as she could. The thought of facing those stares, those whispers, that wall of judgment and pity, made her stomach clench. But she was out of flour, out of salt, almost out of the coffee that had become her only comfort in the mornings. And she needed information. The general store was crowded when she arrived. Saturday was trading day, the day when settlers came in from all over the territory to exchange goods, to catch up on news, to socialize in ways that the isolation of prairie life made rare and precious. The store was full of voices, full of movement, full of life in a way that made Cora feel more alone than ever. She felt the eyes on her the moment she walked in. Conversations paused. Heads turned. The buzz of chatter softened to a murmur as everyone registered her presence, calculated. Her circumstances placed mental bets on how long she would last. Cora kept her head high. She walked to the counter, placed her order, and waited while the storekeeper gathered her supplies. She did not look at the other customers. She did not engage. That was when she heard the voice. It came from the corner of the store near the pot-bellied stove where the old-timers gathered to warm their bones and trade lies. A woman's voice, accented and thin, speaking to no one in particular. In Sweden, the voice said, "We learned that the cold is not something you fight. It is something you understand." Cora turned. The speaker was an old woman. 70 at least, maybe older, with white hair pulled back in braids that wrapped around her head like a crown. Her face was weathered, lined by decades of sun and wind and hard living. Her eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and they seemed to look through things rather than at them. She was sitting alone. The chairs on either side of her were empty. The other customers had arranged themselves in a wide circle around her, as if her foreignness was something contagious. Cora recognized her. Astrid Lindgren, the Swedish widow who lived past the creek. Everyone knew her or knew of her. She had come to Kansas 20 years ago. With her husband, had buried him within a year, had lived alone ever since in a cabin that no one visited, in a life that no one understood. She was considered strange, foreign, a woman who talked too much about the old country and not enough about the things that mattered here. Most people avoided her. Cora walked toward her. The old woman looked up as Cora approached. Those pale eyes, focused, sharpened, took in the young widow with her mourning dress and her grief-hollowed cheeks. "You are the Whitfield woman," Astrid said. "The one whose husband died." "Yes." "Sit." Astrid gestured to the empty chair beside her. "The others. They don't want to hear what I have to say. Maybe you will be different." Cora sat. She could feel the other customers watching, could hear the whispers starting up again, but she didn't care. There was something in the old woman's voice, something that sounded like knowledge rather than gossip, something that sounded like it might actually be useful. You were talking about the cold, Cora said, about understanding it instead of fighting it. Astrid nodded. In Sweden, we have winters that would make Kansas blush, months of darkness, snow that buries houses to their rooftops, cold that can kill a man in minutes if he doesn't know how to protect himself. She paused, her eyes drifting to some distant memory. We learn things there, things that people here have forgotten or never knew. What kind of things? Astrid leaned forward. Her voice dropped as if she were sharing a secret, though in a way she was. Still air, she said. Dead air. Air that does not move. Do you know what happens to air when it cannot move? Cora shook her head. It stops conducting heat. Astrid's pale eyes gleamed. Moving air, it steals warmth. It carries heat away from your body, away from your fire, away from everything you are trying to keep warm. This is why wind makes cold feel colder. The moving air is stealing from you. But still air that is trapped in a space where it cannot circulate, that air becomes an insulator. It holds the warmth in place. It stops the cold from reaching you. Cora felt something stir in her mind, a connection forming, a possibility taking shape. How do you trap air, she asked. How do you keep it from moving? Astrid smiled. It was a thin smile, weathered like the rest of her, but genuine. In Sweden, she said we would hang curtains on the walls, not against the walls, away from them. 2 inches, 3 inches. Enough space for a layer of air to form between the curtain and the timber. The air in that space cannot move. It becomes dead air, and dead air does not conduct heat. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving Cora's face. The cold from the wall hits the dead air and stops. Your room stays warm with half the fire, a quarter of the fire, because you are not heating the cold anymore. You are trapping the warmth. Cora's mind raced. She thought of her cabin, of the gaps in the logs, of the cold that bled through the timber even in September. She thought of the quilts packed away in her trunk. Heavy quilts thick with batting made by her grandmother and her mother and bought with Silas on their honeymoon in Wichita. Quilts that were doing nothing but taking up space. Quilts that could be hung on walls, 2 inches away from the timber. Could this work, she asked. Here in Kansas, with a log cabin with the wind we get in winter. Astrid shrugged. It worked in Sweden. It worked in Minnesota, where I lived before I came here. I see no reason it would not work in Kansas. The physics does not change because you cross a border. Why hasn't anyone else done this? If it's so simple, why doesn't everyone know? Because people don't listen to old Swedish women. Astrid's voice carried a trace of bitterness. They think they know everything already. They think because they have always done things one way, that is the only way things can be done. She shook her head. I have told people, many times. They smile, they nod, they walk away and burn 10 cords of wood trying to fight the cold instead of understanding it. Cora stood up. Her heart was beating fast now, faster than it had since Silas died. Something like hope was stirring in her chest, fragile and uncertain but real. Thank you, she said, for telling me. Astrid looked up at her. Those pale eyes seemed to see right through Cora, to see the grief and the fear and the determination that lay beneath. You will try it, the old woman said. It was not a question. I have to try something. Then let me tell you more. Astrid gestured for Cora to sit back down. The gap is important. 2 inches. No more, no less. Too close and the air cannot form a proper layer. Too far and the air will start to circulate and you lose the insulation. She held up her hands, showing the gap between her palms. 2 inches, like this. You hang your fabric on pegs or hooks, and you make sure it does not touch the wall behind it. What about the door? The door is where most of my cold comes in. Then you create an airlock. Astrid's eyes brightened. Another curtain 3 feet inside the door. When you enter, you close the outer door before you pass the inner curtain. The cold air that comes in with you is trapped in that space. It cannot reach the main room. In Sweden, we called this a windbreak. Every house had one. Cora absorbed this information like a sponge absorbing water. Every word, every detail, every piece of knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death. The storekeeper called her name. Her supplies were ready, but Cora didn't move. She stayed in that chair, listening to the old Swedish woman talk about dead air and thermal layers and the physics of survival. The other customers stared. They whispered. They would talk about this for weeks, about the Whitfield widow sitting with the foreign woman learning whatever nonsense the Swede was peddling. Cora didn't care. For the first time since Silas died, she had something better than hope. She had a plan. The ride home was 3 miles of prairie and sky. Cora sat in the wagon, the reins loose in her hands, her mind working faster than the horse's hooves. She was seeing her cabin differently now. Not as a problem to be solved with brute force with endless cords of wood and fires that burned around the clock, but as a system to be understood. A puzzle with a solution that didn't require more than she could give. The sun was setting by the time she arrived. Long shadows stretched across the prairie, and the first stars were appearing in the eastern sky. Cora unhitched the horses, put them in the small barn that Silas had built their first year on the claim, and walked to the cabin. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the interior with new eyes. The walls were logs chinked with mud and straw, but the chinking was cracked in places, and she could see daylight through some of the gaps. In winter, those gaps would be channels for the cold highways, for the wind that would steal her heat faster than any fire could replace it. She walked to the north wall and placed her palm against the timber. Even now in September, she could feel the coolness of the wood. The north wall faced the wind that came down from Canada, unobstructed by any hill or forest, with nothing to slow it down between here and the Arctic. This wall would be the enemy. The north wall would try to kill her all winter long, unless she could stop it. Cora turned to the trunk at the foot of her bed, the trunk that held her most precious possessions. The things she had brought with her when she married Silas, the things that connected her to the life she had lived before. She opened the lid. The quilts were inside. 3 of them. 4. 5 if she counted the small one that her mother had made for the baby that had never come. She lifted the first one out. It was heavy in her hands, thick with batting the stitches, small and even, where her grandmother's fingers had worked the needle decades ago. The pattern was called Flying Geese, a cascade of triangles that seemed to move across the fabric like birds in migration. Her grandmother had made this quilt in the winter of 1843. She had sewn it by lamplight while snow piled against the windows of her farmhouse in Pennsylvania. She had given it to Cora's mother on her wedding day, and Cora's mother had given it to Cora on hers. It was supposed to be an heirloom, a treasure to be kept safe, to be passed down through generations. Instead, it was going to hang on a wall. Cora carried the quilt to the north wall. She studied the logs, calculating distances, measuring gaps. 2 inches, that's what Astrid had said. 2 inches of dead air between the fabric and the timber. She would need pegs. Wooden pegs driven into the logs at regular intervals with rope or cord strung between them to hold the quilts in place. She could make the pegs herself, whittle them from scrap wood. The rope she had in the barn left over from a project that Silas had never finished. It would take work, days of work maybe, but it could be done. Cora set down the quilt and went to find her knife. The next 2 days blurred together in a haze of labor. Cora woke before dawn each morning and worked until the light failed. She whittled pegs from oak branches, dozens of them, each one roughly uniform in size and shape. She drove them into the log walls with a mallet, spacing them 18 inches apart, creating a grid of anchor points that would hold the quilts in place. The physical work was hard, harder than anything she had ever done. Her hands still healing from her failed attempt at cutting wood, cracked and bled against the rough timber. Her shoulders ached from swinging the mallet. Her back protested every time she bent to pick up another peg. But she kept working, because every peg she drove was a step away from death. Every anchor point was a victory over the cold that would come. On the second day, Harriet Bowen came to visit. Cora heard the wagon approaching and felt her jaw tighten. She had hoped to avoid this, to work in peace without the minister's wife and her opinions. But Harriet was not a woman who took hints, and she was certainly not a woman who let a widow grieve without supervision. The wagon stopped in front of the cabin. Harriet climbed down, her black dress immaculate, her spectacles gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Mrs. Whitfield," she called out, "I've come to check on you." Cora was inside, driving a peg into the east wall. She considered not answering, considered pretending she wasn't home. But the door was open. Harriet was already walking toward it. The minister's wife stepped inside without knocking. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, her eyes moving across the interior of the cabin, taking in the pegs driven into the walls, the ropes strung between them, the quilts laid out on the bed waiting to be hung. "What in heaven's name," Harriet said slowly, "are you doing?" Cora drove another peg into the wall before answering. The sound of the mallet against wood was sharp and satisfying. "Insulating," she said, "insulating." The walls let in cold. Cora didn't stop working. She didn't even look at her visitor. "The quilts will stop it." Harriet stepped further into the cabin, her spectacles catching the light as she turned her head to examine Cora's work. The pegs in the walls, the ropes waiting to be strung, the careful measurements that showed in the spacing. "That's not how quilts work," she said. Her voice carried the particular condescension of someone explaining the obvious to a fool. "You're supposed to wrap yourself in them, not hang them like curtains." Cora finished driving the peg and turned to face her visitor. Her hands were dirty, her dress was stained with sawdust, and her hair had escaped from its braid in a dozen places. She looked nothing like a proper widow. She looked like a woman who was fighting for her life. "My grandmother," Cora said, "would rather keep me alive than be respected in a drawer." Harriet's eyes widened slightly behind her spectacles. The response was not what she had expected. Widows were supposed to be grateful for advice. Widows were supposed to defer to the wisdom of their betters. "Mrs. Whitfield." Harriet adjusted her spectacles, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both patience and disapproval. "You're clearly not thinking clearly. Grief does that to people. It makes them act in ways that don't make sense." She gestured at the walls, at the pegs, at the quilts on the bed. "This is not normal behavior. Hanging quilts on walls like some kind of fabric store. People are talking. Let them talk. They're saying you've lost your grip, that you're not managing well, that you need help whether you want it or not." Harriet's voice softened, but the softness was a weapon. "The Women's Auxiliary is meeting tomorrow to discuss your situation. Several of us feel that intervention may be necessary." Cora set down her mallet. She walked toward Harriet, stopping close enough that she could see her own reflection in those steel-rimmed spectacles. "If you've come to help," she said quietly, "I have more pegs that need driving. If you've come to lecture, I'm afraid I don't have time." Harriet stared at her. For a long moment, neither woman moved, neither spoke. The tension stretched between them like a rope pulled taut. Then Harriet turned and walked out of the cabin. She climbed into her wagon without looking back. She snapped the reins and the horses began to move. Cora watched her go, watched the wagon shrink into the distance until it was just a dark spot on the endless prairie. Then she went back to work. The hanging took 2 full days. Cora worked from dawn to dusk, stopping only to eat and tend to the chickens. She strung ropes between the pegs, creating a lattice that held the quilts exactly 2 inches from the walls. She used every quilt she owned, arranging them according to the wisdom that Astrid had shared. The north wall got the heaviest quilts, her grandmother's flying geese with its thick batting and tight stitches. The quilt her mother had made for her wedding, a double wedding ring pattern in shades of blue and cream. These were the quilts that would face the worst of the cold, the wind that came down from Canada like a living thing intent on killing everything in its path. The east and west walls got lighter quilts. The ones she and Silas had bought together in Wichita, mass-produced but still warm enough to trap a layer of dead air. The ones that would face the morning and evening sun where the cold was less severe. The south wall, the one with the window, got a special treatment. Cora hung a quilt that could be pulled aside during the day, allowing what little winter sun Kansas offered to enter the cabin. At night, it would drop back into place, sealing in the warmth. She sealed the gaps around the door with strips of wool cut from an old blanket. She created a gasket that blocked the drafts that had whistled through every time the wind blew. She hung a second curtain 3 feet inside the door, creating the airlock that Astrid had described. Cold air that got past the outer door would hit the inner curtain and stop trapped in a small space where it could do no harm. By the time she finished, the cabin looked strange. Walls covered in quilts, door wrapped in wool, curtains hanging where no curtains should be. It looked like a grandmother's fever dream, like a fabric store had exploded inside a log cabin. Cora stood in the middle of the room looking at what she had created. Her hands were raw, her back ached. Every muscle in her body was crying out for rest. But she wasn't done yet. She went to the stove. The fire had burned down to coals while she worked. She added a few sticks of kindling, just enough to bring the flames back to life. Then she closed the damper, halfway reducing the airflow, slowing the burn. If Astrid was right, she wouldn't need a roaring fire. She wouldn't need to feed the stove every 30 minutes the way she and Silas had done the previous winter. The dead air spaces would do the work instead. They would trap the warmth, hold it in place, turn her drafty cabin into something that could survive the winter on half the wood. If Astrid was right. Cora sat down in Silas's chair. She waited. The first hour passed slowly. Cora sat in the chair, her eyes moving around the room, watching for signs that the system was working or failing. She wasn't sure which she expected. The hope that had carried her through the past 2 days was starting to fade, replaced by the creeping fear that she had wasted her time, that Harriet was right, that she was losing her grip on reality, hanging quilts on walls like a madwoman while the winter prepared to kill her. The quilts hung motionless on their pegs. The fire crackled softly in the stove. And slowly, so slowly that at first she wasn't sure she was feeling it at all, the room began to warm. It wasn't like the warmth from a roaring fire, the kind that blasted heat in one direction and left the rest of the room cold. This was different, gentler, more even. The warmth seemed to fill the space like water, filling a basin, spreading to every corner, touching every surface. Cora stood up. She walked to the north wall, the wall that had always been cold, the wall that faced the wind from Canada. She put her palm against the quilt that hung there. The fabric was warm, not hot like it would have been if it were pressed against the logs, but warm, body temperature maybe a little above. The dead air behind it was doing exactly what Astrid had said it would do. It was stopping the cold at the wall. It was keeping the warmth in the room. Cora moved to the east wall, the west wall, the south wall with its movable curtain. Everywhere she touched, the quilts were warm. The cabin was warm. The air that wrapped around her was warm in a way that it had never been before. She went to the stove and touched the damper. Still halfway closed, still burning slow and steady, using a fraction of the wood that a normal fire would consume. And the room was warm, not just not cold, warm. The kind of warm that let you take off your shawl and sit comfortably. The kind of warm that didn't require constant feeding, constant attention, constant work. Cora sat back down in Silas's chair. For the first time in weeks, she felt something that wasn't grief or fear or desperate determination. She felt hope. Night came. The sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink before fading to the deep blue of dusk. Stars appeared one by one, then all at once filling the Kansas sky with more light than any city dweller could imagine. The temperature dropped. Cora could feel it through the window, could sense the cold pressing against the glass like an animal trying to get in. September nights in Kansas were not winter nights, but they were cold enough to remind you that winter was coming. She banked the fire before going to bed, pushed the coals together, added a single log, closed the damper almost all the way. In a normal cabin, this would have been suicide. By morning, the fire would be dead, and the room would be freezing, and you would wake up shivering beneath every blanket you owned. But this was not a normal cabin anymore. Cora climbed into bed. She pulled the covers up to her chin and lay there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the prairie night. The wind moving through the grass, the distant call of a coyote, the soft crackle of the fire in its bed of coals. She thought about Silas, about the life they had planned together, the children they had hoped for, the future that had seemed so certain until an axe slipped and a cut turned red and everything fell apart. She thought about Harriet Bowen with her spectacles and her certainty, about the women's auxiliary and their meetings and their predictions of disaster, about a settlement full of people who were waiting for her to fail. She thought about Astrid Lindgren sitting alone in the corner of the general store, sharing knowledge that no one wanted to hear, about dead air and thermal layers in physics that worked whether people believed in it or not. And then she slept. She woke at midnight, not from cold, not from discomfort, just the natural rhythm of her body pulling her briefly to the surface of consciousness before letting her sink back down. In that moment of waking, she registered something important. The room was still warm. She lay there in the darkness, feeling the air around her face, testing it the way you might test water before stepping into a bath. The cabin was warm. Not as warm as it had been when she went to bed, but warm enough, comfortable enough. Nothing like the bitter cold that should have crept in during the night. The quilts were working, the dead air was holding. The fire that should have died hours ago was still burning its coals, glowing softly through the gaps in the stove door. Cora closed her eyes. For the first time since Silas died, she smiled. Morning came with sunlight streaming through the south window. Cora woke slowly, luxuriously, the way she used to wake when Silas was alive and the world felt safe. She lay in bed for a long moment, feeling the warmth of the cabin around her, letting herself enjoy the simple pleasure of not being cold. Then she got up to check the fire. The coals were still glowing. The single log she had added the night before had burned down to almost nothing, but the embers beneath it still held heat. She added kindling, brought the flames back to life, and stood there watching as the stove resumed its work. The cabin was still warm. Even after a full night with the fire bank, the dead air spaces had held enough heat to keep the room comfortable. The quilts hung motionless on their pegs, doing their silent work, turning her drafty cabin into something that felt almost cozy. Cora walked to the window and looked out at the prairie. The sun was rising over the eastern horizon, painting the tall grass in shades of gold and amber. The sky was clear and blue, promising a beautiful day. And in the distance, she could see smoke rising from the chimneys of the other homesteads. Her neighbors already awake, already feeding their stoves, already burning through the wood that would have to last them until spring. They would burn 10 cords this winter. 12, Tom. More if the cold came early and stayed late. She would burn 4, maybe less, because she had stopped fighting the cold. She had learned to understand it instead. She had found the gaps where the heat escaped and put something in their way. Still air, dead air, air that did nothing and in doing nothing, did everything. The math still didn't look good. 4 cords for a whole winter was cutting it close even with the quilts. But it was possible now. The impossible had become merely difficult. And Cora Whitfield had never been afraid of difficult. That afternoon, she walked out to Silas's grave. The mound of earth had settled since the funeral. Grass was already starting to grow on top of it, the prairie reclaiming what had been taken. Soon it would be just another part of the landscape, indistinguishable from the rest unless you knew where to look. Cora stood there for a long moment, her hands at her sides, her eyes fixed on the place where her husband lay. "I figured something out," she said quietly. "The Swedish woman at the store, she taught me about dead air, about trapping warmth instead of fighting cold. I hung your quilts on the walls, the ones your mother made for us. I hope you don't mind." The wind moved through the grass, but there was no answer. There would never be an answer again. "I'm going to make it through the winter." Cora's voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I'm going to prove up the claim. I'm going to keep the land that you worked so hard to build. And next spring, when the grass turns green again, I'm going to plant the garden we always talked about, the one with the roses by the door." She knelt down and placed her hand on the earth. The soil was cool beneath her palm, already holding the chill of autumn. "They said I would fail. They said I needed a husband, needed someone to take care of me." She paused, her jaw tightening. "They were wrong. You knew they were wrong. You married a woman who could take care of herself." She stood up, brushing the dirt from her dress. "I miss you," she said. "Every day, every hour. But I'm not going to die out here. I'm not going to give them the satisfaction." She turned and walked back to the cabin. The quilts hung waiting for her 2 inches from the walls, ready to face whatever winter would bring. The first real test came 2 weeks later. October brought a cold snap that caught everyone off guard. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in a single day, and the wind shifted to the north, bringing the first taste of the brutal cold that would define the months to come. Cora woke that morning to frost on the window. She could see her breath in the air, could feel the cold pressing against the glass. But inside the cabin, wrapped in her cocoon of dead air and quilted walls, the temperature had barely dropped. She fed the stove, not with the desperate urgency of someone trying to fight off the cold, but with the calm efficiency of someone who understood what she was doing. A few logs, a moderate fire, enough heat to warm the air, knowing that the quilts would hold that warmth in place. By mid-morning, the cabin was comfortable. She spent the day inside working on repairs and preparations, mending clothes that would need to last through the winter, checking the stores of food that would have to stretch until spring, counting the firewood that she had, calculating how long it would last, running the numbers again and again. The numbers were starting to look better. Every day that passed was proof that the dead air was working, proof that she could survive on less wood than anyone thought possible, proof that understanding could triumph over brute force. In the afternoon, she heard a wagon approaching. For a moment, her heart sank. Harriet Bowen coming back to lecture her again. The Women's Auxiliary arriving to stage their intervention. Someone from the settlement come to witness her failure firsthand. But when she looked out the window, she saw a different wagon. A smaller one pulled by a single horse. And the figure holding the reins was not Harriet Bowen. It was Astrid Lindgren. The old Swedish woman climbed down from her wagon with the careful movements of someone whose joints had long since stopped cooperating. She walked toward the cabin slowly, her pale eyes taking in the smoke rising from the chimney, the frost on the windows, the general appearance of a homestead that was surviving. Cora met her at the door. "Mrs. Lindgren," she said, "I wasn't expecting you. I was not expecting to come." Astrid's voice was as thin and weathered as her face. "But I wanted to see. To know if you had listened. So many don't. Please come inside." Astrid stepped into the cabin. She stopped just past the threshold, her eyes moving across the quilted walls. The flying geese on the north wall, the wedding rings on the east. The careful arrangement of fabric and dead air that Cora had labored over for 2 days. A small sound escaped the old woman's throat. Something between a laugh and a sob. "You did it," she said. "You actually did it. I followed your instructions." Cora watched Astrid's face, looking for approval, for criticism, for any sign that she had done something wrong. 2 inches from the walls. Heavy quilts to the north. The airlock at the door. Astrid walked deeper into the cabin. She reached out and touched the quilt on the north wall, feeling the fabric, testing the gap behind it. She examined the door, the wool gasket, the inner curtain that created the windbreak. She stood next to the stove and felt the warmth radiating from it, then turned to feel the warmth of the room itself. "How much wood have you burned?" she asked. "Since you finished?" "Not much, maybe half a cord." Cora paused. "It's been 2 weeks. Half a cord in 2 weeks." Astrid nodded slowly. "In a normal cabin, you would have burned 2 cords, maybe more in this cold." "I know." The old woman turned to face Cora. Those pale eyes, colorless as winter sky, seemed to see right through her. "They will not believe you," Astrid said. "When you tell them, when you show them, they will not believe. They will say it is a trick. They will say you are lying about the wood. They will find 1,000 reasons to dismiss what they cannot understand." "I know that too. And still you did it." Astrid's thin face cracked into something that might have been a smile. "You hung your grandmother's quilts on the walls. You listened to a crazy old Swedish woman that everyone else avoids. You did the thing that made no sense because it was the thing that would work." Cora felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back. "I didn't have a choice," she said. "It was this or freeze. There is always a choice, Vaughn." Astrid reached out and took Cora's hand. Her fingers were cold and thin, like twigs wrapped in parchment. "The choice is whether to fight the way everyone expects or to understand the way no one does." She squeezed gently. "You made the right choice." Astrid stayed for an hour. They sat together by the stove, drinking coffee that Cora had made on the modest fire. The old woman talked about Sweden, about winters that lasted 6 months, about houses buried in snow, where families survived on dried fish, and the warmth of their understanding. She talked about coming to America, about the husband who had died in their first year, leaving her alone in a strange country with a language she barely spoke. About the decades since then, living on the margins, keeping the old knowledge alive, even when no one wanted to hear it. "They will come to you," Astrid said, "after the winter, after they see that you survived when they said you would die. They will come with their questions and their doubts and their grudging curiosity. And you will have to decide whether to share what you know." "Why wouldn't I share it?" "Because they laughed at you, because they wanted you to fail, because sharing your knowledge with them is a kindness they do not deserve." Cora considered this. She thought about Harriet Bowen and her spectacles, about the Women's Auxiliary and their meetings, about the whispers and the stares and the wall of judgment that had followed her since Silas died. Then she thought about the children in those other homesteads, about the babies who might freeze in January because their parents were burning wood faster than they could cut it, about the old folks and the sick, in the weak, the ones who couldn't survive a winter that took more than it should. "I'll share it," she said. "If they ask, I'll tell them everything." Astrid nodded. She did not seem surprised. "That is what I hoped you would say." The old woman left as the sun was setting. Cora watched her wagon disappear into the gathering dusk, a dark shape moving across the golden prairie. She stood in the doorway for a long moment after Astrid was gone, feeling the cold air on her face, feeling the warmth of the cabin at her back. The quilts hung motionless on their pegs. The fire crackled softly in the stove. And somewhere out there beyond the horizon, winter was gathering its strength, preparing to sweep down across the plains to test every cabin and every homestead, to find the weak and the unprepared and make them pay the ultimate price. It would come for her too. It would test the dead airspaces, probe the quilted walls, search for any gap or weakness it could exploit. Winter was not a thing that could be defeated. It could only be understood, only be survived. But Cora Whitfield was ready. She had 4 cords of wood and a cabin full of trapped air. She had knowledge that no one else possessed and the determination to use it. She had a piece of land that she would not surrender, a claim that she would prove up come spring, a future that everyone else had written off as impossible. Let them watch. Let them wait. Let them hold their meetings and make their predictions and shake their heads at the widow who had lost her grip on reality. She would show them something they had never seen before. A woman who refused to burn her way through winter. A woman who found a better way. Cora stepped back inside and closed the door. The quilts surrounded her like armor. The dead air held her warmth like a promise. And outside, the first stars of evening appeared, watching over a prairie that had no idea what was about to change. November came like a thief in the night. One day the prairie was gold and amber, the tall grass swaying in winds that still carried a memory of warmth. The next day, the world turned gray. The sky lowered itself toward the earth, heavy with clouds that promised snow. The temperature dropped and kept dropping, and the wind shifted to the north with a permanence that said summer was truly gone. Cora woke on the first morning of true cold and lay in bed for a long moment, testing the air. The cabin was warm, not hot, not summer warm, but comfortable in a way that should have been impossible given the frost she could see on the window, given the howl of wind she could hear outside. The quilts hung motionless on their pegs, doing their silent work, and the fire in the stove was burning low and steady, barely more than coals. She got up and added a single log to the fire. Then she stood by the stove, warming her hands, looking at the room she had transformed. It was working. Day after day, night after night, the dead air spaces were holding. The warmth stayed in, the cold stayed out. And the wood pile behind the cabin was shrinking so slowly that she had to measure it against the wall to notice any change at all. The math was starting to work. 4 cords might actually be enough. The settlement noticed. Of course they noticed. In a community this small, everyone noticed everything. They noticed when someone's chickens stopped laying. They noticed when someone's roof started leaking. They noticed when someone's marriage was troubled, or someone's child was sick, or someone's faith was wavering. And they definitely noticed when the Whitfield widow burned less wood than anyone else in 50 miles. The talk started small, the way it always did. Whispers at the well, murmurs after church, sidelong glances at the general store when Cora came in for supplies. She heard the questions even when they weren't asked directly. How is she doing it? Why isn't she freezing? What's really going on in that cabin? The answers people invented were more interesting than the truth. Someone said she had found a coal seam on her property and was burning coal instead of wood. Someone else said she had a secret cache of firewood hidden somewhere, brought in from town under cover of darkness. A third person suggested, only half joking, that she had made some kind of deal with the devil. Nobody suggested that she had simply found a better way. That would have been too simple, too threatening, too much like admitting that they had all been doing it wrong. Harriet Bowen was the loudest voice in the chorus of doubt. The minister's wife had not forgotten the way Cora had dismissed her, had not forgotten the closed door, the turn back, the flat refusal to accept the help that had been so graciously offered. Harriet Bowen was not a woman who forgot slights, and she was certainly not a woman who forgave them. She spoke about Cora at the women's auxiliary meetings. She spoke about her after church in the gathering space where people lingered to exchange news. She spoke about her at the general store, at the well, at every social occasion where 2 or more settlers gathered to share their concerns about the world. The Whitfield woman, Harriet, would say, adjusting her spectacles with that particular gesture of hers, is not in her right mind. Hanging quilts on walls like some kind of foreign ritual. Learning nonsense from that Swedish woman who lives past the creek. She shook her head slowly, performatively. Grief does strange things to people. We should pray for her. The prayers Harriet offered were not the kind that healed. They were the kind that condemned. And slowly, carefully, persistently, she began to poison the well, to turn the settlement's curiosity into suspicion, to transform Cora's innovation into evidence of instability. Foreign knowledge, Harriet called it. Outsider thinking. The kind of ideas that had no place in a Christian community brought by people who had no understanding of how things were done in America. She never said it directly. She never had to. The implication was clear enough. The Swedish woman was dangerous, and anyone who listened to her was dangerous too. Cora felt a shift in the community's attitude, like a change in the weather. People who had nodded at her in town now looked away. Neighbors who had once waved from their wagons now kept their eyes forward. The storekeeper, who had always been friendly, became curt and distant, counting out her change without meeting her eyes. She understood what was happening. She had seen it before in other places with other people who had dared to be different. The community was drawing a line, and she was on the wrong side of it. But understanding something did not make it hurt less. On a cold morning in late November, Cora went to the general store for flour and salt. She walked in to find Harriet Bowen holding court near the pot-bellied stove, surrounded by a cluster of women who hung on her every word. The conversation stopped the moment Cora entered, Harriet's eyes magnified by her spectacles fixed on Cora with an expression that was almost triumphant. The other women shifted uncomfortably, caught between their loyalty to the minister's wife and their vestigial sense of politeness. "Mrs. Whitfield," Harriet said. Her voice was sweet as honey and twice as sticky. "We were just talking about you. I'm sure you were. We're concerned." Harriet's smile did not waver. "Winter is here, and you're all alone in that cabin with your quilted walls and your foreign ideas. Several of us were saying that perhaps it's time to revisit the offer my husband made. The widower in Dodge City is still interested, you know. It's not too late to make a sensible choice." Cora looked at the women surrounding Harriet, at their careful faces, their downcast eyes, their silence that spoke louder than words. They were not her enemies, most of them. They were simply followers going along with the strongest voice in the room, because going along is easier than standing apart. "Thank you for your concern," Cora said, the same words she had used before, flat and cold. "But I'm managing fine." "Managing?" Harriet's voice sharpened slightly. "Is that what you call it? Burning through your husband's legacy, pretending that hanging blankets on walls will keep you alive through a Kansas winter? I call it surviving." Cora met Harriet's gaze and held it. "Which is more than your predictions suggested I would do." The temperature in the room dropped several degrees that had nothing to do with the weather outside. "We shall see," Harriet said softly. "Winter has barely begun, Mrs. Whitfield. Come January, when the real cold arrives, we shall see who was right." She turned back to her audience, dismissing Cora as completely as if she had never been there at all. Cora collected her supplies, paid for them without speaking, and walked out into the cold. The walk home was 3 miles of frozen prairie and bitter wind. Cora barely felt it. Her mind was churning, replaying the conversation, turning over Harriet's words like stones in a riverbed. The anger she felt was hot and sharp, a blade that cut in both directions. She was angry at Harriet for her cruelty, her certainty, her smug assumption that she knew how the world worked and everyone else was simply wrong. But she was also angry at herself. Angry for caring what Harriet thought. Angry for letting the woman's words burrow under her skin. Angry for still seeking approval from a community that had already decided she was not worth approving. She was halfway home when she saw the wagon. It was coming from the opposite direction, from the far side of the creek, where the land flattened out and the homesteads were fewer and farther between. A small wagon pulled by a single horse, driven by a figure wrapped in so many layers that it was impossible to tell if it was man or woman, young or old. But Cora knew. She would have recognized that wagon anywhere. Recognized the careful way the driver held the reins, the patient pace that said there was no hurry, the particular shade of weathered wood that marked it as belonging to someone who had been on the prairie for a very long time. Astrid Lindgren was coming to visit. They met on the road, their wagons pulling alongside each other like ships passing in a harbor. "Mrs. Whitfield," Astrid's voice was muffled by the scarf wrapped around her face, but her pale eyes were bright above it. "I was coming to see you, and I was just coming from town." Cora gestured back the way she had come, "Where I learned that I am the subject of considerable discussion." Astrid made a sound that might have been a laugh. The minister's wife, she has a talent for talking. She has a talent for many things, none of them kind. Astrid's eyes crinkled slightly. But I did not come to talk about her. I came to see how you are surviving and to teach you something more. More, the dead air spaces are good. They will save your life this winter. But there are refinements. Astrid unwrapped the scarf from her face, revealing weathered skin and thin lips set in a determined line. Things I did not have time to explain before. Things that will make the difference between surviving and thriving. Cora looked at the old woman, at the pale eyes that held decades of knowledge, at the hands thin and gnarled that had built and maintained a homestead alone for 20 years. Then follow me home, she said. I'll make coffee. They sat in Cora's cabin as the afternoon light faded and the temperature dropped outside. Astrid examined everything with the careful attention of an expert reviewing another's work. She touched the quilts, tested the gaps, checked the seals around the door. She examined the airlock, the wool gaskets, the way the inner curtain hung from its rod. Good, she said finally. Better than good. You listen well. I had motivation. Motivation sharpens the mind. Astrid settled into the chair that Cora offered, accepting a cup of coffee with both hands. But there is always more to learn, always refinements. The difference between surviving and thriving is often in the details. What details? Astrid pointed at the window, the south-facing window that let in what little winter sun Kansas offered. You have the quilt that can be pulled aside during the day. That is good, but you could do better. How the sun gives heat even in winter. Weak heat, yes, but heat nonetheless. If you open the quilt during the sunny hours and close it as soon as the sun drops below the horizon, you capture that heat inside your dead air spaces. The quilts hold it through the night. You gain warmth without burning anything at all. Cora nodded slowly. She had been opening the quilt during the day, but without any particular schedule. Without thinking about it as a system. What else? Your floor? Astrid pointed down. The cold comes from below as well as from the sides. If you have rugs, old blankets, anything that can cover the boards, you create another dead air layer. The heat in the room stays in the room instead of bleeding into the frozen ground. I have rugs, then use them. Every surface that touches the outside world is a place where heat can escape. Your job is to put dead air between yourself and every one of those surfaces. Cora's mind raced. She thought about the floor, about the rugs rolled up in the corner, because she had not wanted to dirty them with winter mud. She thought about the ceiling, the rafters, the space above her head where warm air rose and cold air waited. What about the ceiling? She asked. Astrid smiled. It was a thin smile, but genuine. Now you are thinking like a Swede. Yes, the ceiling. Heat rises. If you have fabric to spare, hang it below the rafters. Create another dead air space above your head. You will be amazed at the difference. I don't have fabric to spare. Everything I own is already on the walls. Then wait until spring. Astrid's smile faded slightly. You will survive this winter with what you have. But next winter and the winter after that you can improve. You can refine. You can make your cabin so efficient that you could heat it with a candle. She paused, her pale eyes growing serious. But that is not why I really came. Cora set down her coffee cup. What do you mean? I mean that I came to warn you. Astrid's voice dropped, taking on a weight that had not been there before. The minister's wife, she is not just talking. She is organizing. Building a case against you, against me. A case, she is saying, that you have been corrupted by foreign influence. That the Swedish method, as she calls it, is dangerous. That it goes against the natural order of things. Against God's plan for how people should live. That's absurd. Of course it is absurd. Astrid's hands tightened around her cup, but absurdity has never stopped people from believing things, especially when they are afraid, especially when believing the absurdity is easier than admitting they have been wrong. Cora felt a cold knot forming in her stomach, a different kind of cold than the winter wind outside. This was the cold of understanding that she was not just fighting the elements. She was fighting something far more dangerous, human nature. What does she want? Cora asked. What is she really after? She wants you to fail. Astrid's voice was flat and hard. She wants you to come crawling into town begging for help, proving that everything she said was true. That a woman alone cannot survive. That foreign knowledge is worthless. That she was right all along. And if I don't fail, then she will find another way to destroy you. Astrid leaned forward, her pale eyes intense. People like her, they cannot tolerate being wrong. It threatens everything they believe about themselves, about the world. If you succeed, you prove that their entire way of understanding reality is flawed. They will never forgive you for that. The words hung in the air between them, heavy as winter clouds. Cora thought about Harriet Bowen, about her spectacles and her certainty, about the way she had looked at Cora in the general store with triumph already gleaming in her eyes. She was so sure that Winter would prove her right, so sure that Cora would break. Then I will have to make sure I don't break, Cora said quietly. Astrid nodded. She reached across the table and took Cora's hand. They will not forgive you for being right, she said. People hate being proved wrong more than they hate the cold itself. Remember that. Prepare for it, and do not let their hatred make you doubt what you know to be true. December arrived with a blizzard. The snow came down in sheets driven by winds that screamed across the prairie like something alive and angry. Visibility dropped to nothing. The world beyond the cabin windows became a white void, swirling and howling, trying to claw its way inside. Cora watched it from her warm cabin. She had done everything Astrid suggested. The rugs now covered the floor, creating another layer of insulation between her and the frozen ground. She had rearranged her schedule around the sun, opening the south quilt during the bright hours and closing it the moment the light began to fade. She had sealed gaps she hadn't even noticed before, places where the cold had been sneaking through without her knowledge. And it was working. The blizzard raged for 3 days. 3 days of wind and snow and temperatures that dropped low enough to kill an unprotected person in minutes. 3 days when the fire in the stove was the only barrier between life and death. Except it wasn't the only barrier. The quilts were there. The dead air spaces were there. The accumulated wisdom of Swedish winters distilled into fabric and careful measurements was there. Cora burned 2 logs each day. 2 logs when her neighbors were burning 2 dozen. 2 logs when the homesteads around her were consuming firewood at rates that would leave them desperate by February. 2 logs and the cabin stayed warm enough that she could work without her coat, could sleep without shivering, could move through her days with something approaching normalcy. On the 3rd day of the blizzard, she took out a piece of paper and began to keep records. Wood burned, temperature maintained, hours of warmth per log. She wrote down everything, creating a document that would prove what she had accomplished, a record that could not be dismissed as imagination or exaggeration. When the blizzard finally passed, when the sun emerged to reveal a world transformed by snow, Cora had burned 6 logs. 6 logs for 3 days of the worst weather she had ever seen. The math was not just working. The math was miraculous. Word of her survival spread through the settlement like smoke from a chimney. People had expected the Whitfield widow to freeze during the blizzard, had expected to find her cabin cold and her body stiff when the storm finally lifted. Harriet Bowen had practically predicted it, telling anyone who would listen that this was the test that the widow's foolishness would finally catch up with her. But Cora didn't freeze. Cora didn't even come close. When the settlement began to dig out from the snow, when wagons started moving again, and people started talking again, the story of the quilted cabin was on everyone's lips, not with the mockery it had carried before, with something different, something that sounded almost like curiosity. How did she do it? How is she still alive? What does she know that we don't? The questions multiplied. They whispered through the settlement like wind through tall grass, growing louder each time they were repeated. And slowly, reluctantly, people began to reconsider their assumptions. Maybe the Swedish woman wasn't crazy. Maybe the quilted walls weren't foolishness. Maybe there was something to this dead air business after all. Harriet Bowen felt her influence slipping. She responded the only way she knew how, by doubling down, by speaking louder more frequently, with greater certainty than ever before. One storm proves nothing, she declared at the Women's Auxiliary meeting in mid-December. Winter is long. The real cold hasn't even arrived yet. Just wait until January. Just wait until February. Then we'll see who was right. But her voice lacked the conviction it once had. And the women around her, the followers who had always nodded along with her pronouncements, were starting to exchange glances, starting to wonder. They had burned through their wood during the blizzard, burned through it at rates that frightened them. Some of them were already worried about making it through until spring, already calculating whether they would need to buy more fuel from town, already feeling the pinch of a winter that took more than they could afford to give. And the Whitfield widow, alone in her cabin with her quilted walls, had barely touched her woodpile. The math was starting to speak louder than Harriet Bowen. Christmas came and went with little fanfare. Cora spent the holiday alone as she had spent every day since Silas died. She cooked a modest meal read from the Bible that had belonged to her mother and allowed herself a few hours of memory, thinking about the Christmases she and Silas had shared, the modest gifts they had exchanged, the plans they had made for the future plans that would never come true now. But the grief that had consumed her in September was different now. Not gone, never gone, but changed, transmuted into something else, something that felt less like drowning and more like swimming. She was going to make it, not just through Christmas, through the whole winter, through the spring and the summer and the years that stretched beyond. She was going to prove up the claim, keep the land, build the life that Silas had dreamed of, even if he wasn't there to share it. The certainty of this settled into her bones like warmth from the stove. She was going to make it, and everyone who had bet against her was going to have to live with that. January brought the coldest temperatures anyone could remember. The old-timers, the ones who had been on the prairie for decades, shook their heads and said they had never seen anything like it. The thermometer at the general store registered 20 below zero, then 30, then 40. The wind chill made it feel even colder. People spoke in hushed voices about livestock freezing in their pens, about water turning to ice before it could be carried from the well to the house, about the terrible mathematics of a winter that was determined to take everything it could. Cora watched her neighbors struggle. She could see the smoke pouring from their chimneys, thick and constant, as they fed their fires around the clock. She could see the trips to the woodpile growing more frequent as the cold deepened. She could see the worry in their faces when they came to town, the fear of running out of burning through their supplies before the winter burned through its fury. And she could see the way they looked at her cabin, at the thin ribbon of smoke that rose from her chimney, at the modest pace of her own trips to the woodpile, at the evidence impossible to deny that she was doing something different, something that worked. People started asking questions, quietly at first, sidelong inquiries at the general store, casual comments that weren't casual at all. They wanted to know how she was doing it, what her secret was, whether the rumors about the quilted walls were true. Cora answered when asked. She explained about dead air, about thermal layers, about the physics that Astrid had taught her. She showed them her records, the careful documentation of wood burned and temperatures maintained. She offered to let them see the cabin for themselves, to touch the quilts, to feel the warmth that shouldn't have been possible. Some took her up on the offer. They came one or two at a time, skeptical but curious, expecting to find some trick or illusion. What they found was exactly what Cora had described. A cabin hung with quilts, a fire burning low, and warmth that filled every corner of the room. They left with questions, with doubts about everything they thought they knew, with the first stirrings of something that might in time become belief. February arrived with Cora's woodpile still half full. She had burned less than 3 cords since September. 3 cords for 5 months of winter, including the worst cold anyone could remember. The math was not just working. The math was revolutionary, and everyone knew it. The settlement could no longer deny what was happening, could no longer pretend that the Whitfield widow was lucky or lying, or somehow cheating the fundamental rules of survival. The evidence was too clear. The woodpile was too large. The cabin was too warm. She had done what everyone said was impossible. She had survived a Kansas winter on half the fuel alone, without a husband or a helper or anyone to rely on but herself. And she had done it by hanging quilts on her walls. Harriet Bowen came to visit on a February afternoon. Cora was outside when she heard the wagon approaching. She was feeding the chickens scattered grain across the snow, watching the birds peck and squabble in their eternal competition for food. The cold was sharp against her face, but not unbearable. She wore a wool dress and a light shawl, nothing more. The wagon stopped in front of the cabin. Harriet climbed down, slowly wrapped in so many layers that she looked like a woolen boulder. Her spectacles were fogged from her breath, and she wiped them impatiently as she approached. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said. Her voice was different than it had been before. Smaller, less certain. "I've come to see how you are managing." Cora straightened up the feed bucket in her hand. I'm managing fine, she said. Better than fine. I notice your wood pile seems larger than I expected for February. Does it? They stood there for a moment facing each other across the frozen ground. The minister's wife and the widow, the doubter and the proof. Would you like to come inside and see why, Cora asked. Harriet didn't want to come inside. Cora could see it in her face and the way her body tensed at the invitation. For months she had been telling everyone that the Whitfield cabin was a monument to foolishness, that the quilted walls were useless, that the widow would freeze and fail and prove everything Harriet had said about women alone and foreign ideas. Coming inside meant facing the possibility that she had been wrong, but she couldn't refuse. Not now. Not with her own predictions hanging over her head like a judgment. Not with the whole settlement watching to see what would happen. She climbed the steps to the door. Cora led her through the airlock past the inner curtain into the main room of the cabin, and Harriet stopped. Just stopped standing in the middle of the floor, her fogged spectacles clearing slowly as she turned her head to take in what she was seeing. The quilts on every wall, the ropes and pegs that held them in place, the careful gaps between fabric and timber, and the warmth. The warmth hit her like a wave, like stepping from winter into summer, like walking into a different world entirely. The cabin was comfortable. Not just warm enough to survive, but genuinely, truly comfortable. The kind of warmth that let you take off your coat. The kind of warmth that didn't require constant feeding and tending and work. And the fire in the stove was barely burning. A few coals, a single log, nothing like the roaring infernos that Harriet kept in her own home. How the word came out small and strange, stripped of all its usual authority. How is it this warm you've barely got a fire going? Cora gestured at the walls. The quilts, she said simply. They trap a layer of air between themselves and the timber. The air can't move, so it can't carry heat away. The cold from the walls hits the dead air and stops. The warmth stays in the room instead of bleeding out through the logs. That's not possible. It's happening right now. You're standing in it. Harriet stood there for a long moment, her spectacles catching the light from the window. Her certainty, the bedrock on which she had built her entire identity, was cracking. You could see it in her face, in the way her mouth opened and closed without producing words, in the way her eyes kept moving from the quilts to the stove and back again, trying to find some flaw, some trick, some explanation that would let her maintain what she had always believed. There was no explanation. There was only the truth hanging on every wall, filling every corner, impossible to deny. Cora pulled a chair from the table. Would you like to sit down, she asked. The pot's been warm all morning. Doesn't take much heat to keep it that way when the heat doesn't escape. Harriet sat. She accepted the cup of coffee that Cora poured for her, wrapping her hands around it as if she needed the additional warmth despite the comfort of the room. She stared into the dark liquid for a long moment before speaking. How much wood have you burned this winter? About 4 cords, maybe 4.5. 4 cords. The words fell from Harriet's lips like stones dropped into still water. I've burned 9. The confession hung in the air between them. 9 cords, more than twice what Cora had used, and the winter was not even over yet. My husband Harriet, continued, her voice flat and strange. He's burned 11 at the church. He's already worried about running out, about what will happen if March stays cold. You don't have dead air spaces, Cora said quietly. Your heat goes straight through the walls and out into the prairie. Harriet looked up at her. Those magnified eyes, always so full of judgment and certainty, were suddenly vulnerable, suddenly old. The Swedish woman taught you this, yes. How did she know? Her people have been doing it for centuries. Cora sipped her own coffee, watching the minister's wife over the rim of the cup. Still air doesn't conduct heat. It's just physics. It's foreign nonsense. But even as Harriet said it, her voice carried no conviction. She was sitting in the proof. She was drinking coffee that had stayed warm all morning. She was wrapped in warmth that her own house with its roaring fires and its 11 cords of wood could not match. It's keeping me alive, Cora said, while you burn 11 cords trying to heat a church with gaps in the walls. Silence. Long, heavy silence that filled the room like smoke from a fire. Harriet stared at her coffee, at the quilts, at the stove that was barely burning, at the room that was warmer than anything she had ever experienced in her own home. She was thinking. You could see it in her face. thinking about all the things she had said, all the predictions she had made, all the certainty she had projected about the Whitfield widow and her foolish walls, her foreign ideas. You told everyone I would freeze, Cora said quietly. You told everyone I needed a husband. You told everyone a woman alone couldn't survive a Kansas winter. Harriet said nothing. How's that working out for you, Miss Bowen? Still nothing. Harriet set down her coffee cup. She hadn't finished it, hadn't drunk more than a few sips. Her hands were trembling slightly as she withdrew them from the table. She stood up. Thank you for the coffee, she said. Her voice was hollow, empty of everything that usually filled it. I should be going. Cora didn't try to stop her. She watched as Harriet walked to the door, as she pushed through the airlock curtain, and as she stepped out into the cold that waited beyond. She watched as the minister's wife climbed into her wagon, as she snapped the reins as the horses began to pull. The wagon moved away across the frozen prairie, growing smaller and smaller, until it was just a dark speck against the white. Harriet Bowen had left without finishing her coffee, without acknowledging what she had seen, without apologizing or admitting she had been wrong. But she had left, and that was something. The silence that followed was different. Harriet stopped talking about the Whitfield widow, stopped predicting disaster, stopped organizing the women's auxiliary meetings around Cora's supposed failures. She didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge that she had been wrong, didn't show any sign that her visit to the quilted cabin had changed her in any fundamental way. But she stopped. And in a community as small as this one, silence was its own kind of statement. People noticed that Harriet was no longer leading the chorus of criticism. They noticed that her predictions had failed to materialize. They noticed that the widow she had written off as doomed was still alive, still warm, still standing in front of her half-full woodpile with a light shawl and a steady gaze. The math was speaking louder than any minister's wife could, and the math said that Cora Whitfield had found a better way. March came slowly. The days began to lengthen. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The temperatures, while still cold, lost some of their killing edge. The worst of winter was passing, and the promise of spring was beginning to whisper across the prairie. Cora walked out to survey her woodpile on a March morning that felt almost warm. She counted the cords that remained, measured them against the wall the way she had been doing all winter, checked her records, her careful documentation of everything she had burned. 4.5 cords consumed since September. The pile that remained would last another month at least, maybe 2. More than enough to see her through until the weather truly turned, until she could open the cabin and let the spring air flow through. She had done it. She had survived a Kansas winter alone, had kept herself warm on half the fuel, had proven everyone wrong who had said it couldn't be done. And she had done it by refusing to fight the cold the way everyone else fought it, by understanding instead of burning, by working with physics instead of against it. The land office was 20 miles away. She would need to go there soon to file the paperwork that would prove up her claim, to sign the documents that would make this land officially hers. Silas's dream completed, not the way he had planned, not with him beside her to celebrate, but completed nonetheless. Astrid Lindgren came to visit on a day when the snow was beginning to melt. She climbed down from her wagon with the slow, careful movements of old age, but her pale eyes were bright as she approached the cabin. She had heard, of course. Everyone had heard. The story of the widow and her woodpile, the minister's wife and her coffee, the settlement and its slowly changing opinions. You survived, Astrid said. I survived, and the minister's wife, she doesn't talk about me anymore. Cora smiled slightly. I think that's as close to an apology as I'm going to get. It is more than most get. Astrid returned the smile, her weathered face creasing in unfamiliar lines. You have done something remarkable, Mrs. Whitfield. Not just surviving, but proving, showing them that there is another way. They're starting to ask questions, some of them, wanting to know how it works. And you tell them everything they want to know. Cora thought about the visitors she had received over the past weeks, the skeptics who left as believers, the doubters who touched the quilts and felt the warmth and couldn't deny what their own senses told them. If it can help them, why wouldn't I share it? Astrid nodded slowly. Her eyes held something that might have been pride, or perhaps recognition, the look of someone seeing themselves reflected in another. That is what I hoped you would do, she said, what I always hoped, but could never accomplish alone. Why not? Because I am old. Because I am foreign. Because people see my accent and my braids and decide that nothing I say can be worth hearing. Astrid's voice carried no bitterness, only the calm acceptance of things that could not be changed. But you are different. You are young. You are one of them. When you speak, they might actually listen. Cora considered this. She thought about the settlers who had visited her cabin, the ones who were still skeptical, still resistant, the ones who wanted to believe but couldn't quite let go of their old assumptions. And she thought about the ones who were starting to change their minds. Come spring, Cora said, I'm going to teach anyone who wants to learn how to hang quilts, how to create dead air spaces, how to survive winter without burning their futures in their stoves. Astrid reached out and took her hand. Those thin, papery fingers squeezed gently. That is what I came to hear, she said. The day Cora rode to the land office was the first truly warm day of spring. The prairie was coming back to life around her, green shoots pushing through the brown grass, birds calling from territories they were reclaiming, the whole world stirring from its winter sleep, stretching toward the sun that grew stronger with each passing day. Cora sat in the wagon, the reins loose in her hands, and let herself feel the full weight of what she had accomplished. 6 months ago, she had stood at her husband's grave and done math that said she would die. Math that said the wood wouldn't last, the cold would win, the winter would take her the way it took everyone who wasn't prepared. But she had found another way. She had listened to an old Swedish woman when no one else would. She had hung quilts on her walls when everyone said it was foolishness. She had learned that the air between things could matter more than the things themselves. And she had survived. The land office was a small building at the edge of town. Cora climbed down from her wagon, smoothed her dress, and walked inside. The clerk looked up as she entered, recognized her from her previous visits, and smiled. Mrs. Whitfield, he said, here to prove up your claim I am. The paperwork took an hour, signatures and stamps and official declarations that made the land hers legally and permanently. When it was done, the clerk handed her the final document with a nod of professional satisfaction. Congratulations, he said. The land is yours. Cora walked out of the land office with the paper in her hand. She stood on the wooden sidewalk looking out at the town that had expected her to fail. At the general store where Harriet Bowen had held court. At the church where Reverend Bowen had preached about the dangers of foreign knowledge. They had all been wrong, and she had the paper to prove it. So Cora rode home as the sun began to set. The prairie stretched around her, endless and golden, full of the promise that spring always brought. New growth, new beginnings, new chances to build something that would last. She thought about Silas, about the man who had brought her here, who had dreamed of a life on this land, who had died before he could see that dream come true. She thought about Astrid, about the old woman who had shared her knowledge when no one else would listen, who had given Cora the tools she needed to survive. She thought about Harriet, about the minister's wife who had wanted so badly for her to fail, who had predicted disaster with such certainty, who had left her cabin with coffee unfinished and certainty shattered. And she thought about the winter that was behind her now. The coldest winter anyone could remember. The winter that had tested her, challenged her, tried to break her in 1,000 different ways. She had survived. Not by fighting harder, not by burning more, but by understanding the cold instead of opposing it. The cabin came into view as the last light of day painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. The quilts were still hanging inside, though she would take them down soon, air them out, store them for the next winter. But they would go back up come fall. They would hang on those walls for years to come. And slowly, one family at a time, the whole settlement would learn what she had learned. That still air could save you. That understanding could triumph over force. That the gap between things was sometimes more important than the things themselves. Cora pulled the wagon to a stop in front of her cabin. Her land, her future. She climbed down and walked to the door. The quilts hung waiting for her inside, patient as always. She had survived the winter of doubt, and spring was just beginning. The words spread differently now, not as mockery, not as gossip designed to wound, but as something closer to wonder, passing from homestead to homestead, like seeds carried on the spring wind. Have you heard about the Whitfield cabin? Have you seen her woodpile? Do you know what she did with quilts? The questions multiplied as the snow melted and the prairie came back to life. People who had spent the winter huddled around roaring fires, burning through cord after cord of precious firewood, began to look at their empty wood piles and wonder if there might have been another way. 6 families came to visit Cora in the first weeks of spring. They came one at a time or in pairs, driving their wagons across the muddy prairie roads with expressions that mixed skepticism and hope. They were the practical ones, the settlers who cared more about results than about pride. The ones who had watched their winter supplies dwindle and wondered how they would make it through another year of the same. Cora welcomed them all. She showed them the quilts still hanging on the walls, though the need for them had passed. She explained the principle of dead air, drawing diagrams in the dust of her floor, the way Astrid had drawn them for her. She let them feel the fabric, measure the gaps, understand with their hands what their minds were still struggling to accept. And one by one, they began to believe. The Hendersons were the first to try it. Marcus Henderson was a farmer in his 50s, a man with weathered hands and a practical mind who had no patience for foolishness, but even less patience for waste. He had burned 12 cords of wood the previous winter, more than he could afford, and the thought of doing it again made his stomach clench. He came to Cora's cabin on an April morning, his wife Sarah beside him, their faces carrying the particular desperation of people who have run out of other options. "Show us," he said. "Show us everything." Cora spent 3 hours with them. She walked them through every detail, every measurement, every principle that Astrid had taught her. She showed them her records, the careful documentation of wood burned and temperatures maintained. She answered every question, addressed every doubt, explained every aspect of the system until there was nothing left to explain. When they left, Marcus Henderson's face had changed. The skepticism was gone. In its place was something that looked almost like hope. "We'll do it," he said. "Before next winter, we'll hang every blanket we own." Word of the Hendersons' conversion spread quickly. If Marcus Henderson, the most practical man in the settlement, believed in the quilted walls, then maybe there was something to it after all. Maybe the Whitfield widow wasn't crazy. Maybe the Swedish woman's knowledge was worth learning. 3 more families came to visit that week, then 4 more the week after that. By the time May arrived, Cora had hosted more visitors than she had seen in her entire time on the prairie. She taught them all. She drew diagrams and explained physics and demonstrated techniques until her voice grew hoarse and her hands ached from pointing. She repeated the same information 100 times, tailoring it to each visitor's understanding, finding new ways to explain concepts that should have been simple, but somehow weren't. And slowly the settlement began to change. Astrid came to help. The old Swedish woman arrived one morning in her familiar wagon, her pale eyes bright with a purpose that seemed to have taken years off her weathered face. She had heard about the visitors, about the questions, about the growing demand for knowledge that she had carried alone for so long. "You cannot teach them all yourself," she told Cora. "There are too many, and some of them will listen better to an old woman than to a young widow. They don't listen to you." Cora remembered what Astrid had told her about the years of being ignored, dismissed, avoided. "They never have. They listen now." Astrid smiled, and the expression transformed her face. "Because of you. Because you proved that the knowledge works. I am no longer a crazy foreigner talking about things no one understands. I am the woman who taught the widow who survived." It was true. Cora could see it in the faces of the settlers who came to visit. They looked at Astrid differently now, with respect instead of suspicion, with attention instead of dismissal. The success of the quilted cabin had changed not just Cora's reputation, but Astrid's as well. The 2 women began to work together. They divided the visitors between them, each taking half each, teaching the same principles in their own way. They visited homesteads that couldn't come to them, spreading the knowledge across the settlement like farmers spreading seed. They drew diagrams in dust and on paper, explained physics in simple terms, demonstrated techniques that had been perfected over centuries of Swedish winters. By summer, 6 families had committed to quilting their walls before fall. By autumn, that number had doubled. The general store became a different place, where once the conversations had been about weather and crops and the endless small dramas of frontier life, now they were about dead air and thermal layers and the proper distance between fabric and timber. The settlers argued about techniques, compared notes on their preparations, discussed the merits of different quilting patterns with the intensity of scholars debating philosophy. Cora walked into the store one September afternoon and found herself at the center of a conversation she hadn't started. Mrs. Whitfield, a farmer named Silas Green, turned to face her, his expression earnest. We were just discussing the north wall. My wife thinks we should use the heaviest quilts there, but I was thinking maybe double layers would be better. What do you recommend? Heavy quilts, Cora said. Single layer, but the thickest batting you have. The north wall faces the worst of the wind. You want mass there, not complexity. See, Silas turned back to the group. I told you she'd know. Cora looked around at the faces watching her. Farmers and their young couples and old-timers. People who had once whispered about her, predicted her failure, waited for her to break. Now they were asking for her advice. The reversal was so complete, so unexpected, that she almost laughed. Almost. But the practical part of her, the part that had survived the winter and proved up the claim and built something from nothing, knew better than to gloat. If you have questions, she said instead, come out to the cabin. I'll show you everything you need to know. Harriet Bowen watched from the corner of the store. The minister's wife had not spoken to Cora since that February afternoon when she had left with Pierre, coffee unfinished and her certainty shattered. She had not apologized, had not acknowledged the truth, had not shown any sign that her world had changed. But she had stopped fighting. The Women's Auxiliary no longer discussed Cora's situation. The predictions of disaster had ceased entirely. Harriet had retreated into a silence that spoke louder than any words could have. Cora caught her eye across the crowded store. For a moment, the two women looked at each other. The widow who had survived and the prophet who had been wrong. The woman who had learned and the woman who had refused to. Then Harriet looked away. She turned and walked out of the store without buying anything. Her spine still stiff, her spectacles still gleaming, but something essential diminished. The certainty that had once radiated from her like heat from a stove had flickered and dimmed, leaving behind only the shell of what she had been. Cora watched her go. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction in her former enemy's decline, only a kind of tired understanding that some people could not admit they were wrong no matter how clear the evidence, that for some being right was less important than never having been seen to be wrong. Harriet Bowen would carry her pride to her grave, but she would carry it alone. The second winter was easier, not because the cold was less severe. If anything, the winter of 1886 to 87 was harsher than the one before, with deeper snow and longer stretches of bitter cold. But Cora faced it with the confidence of experience, with walls already quilted and techniques already perfected, with a full woodpile that she knew would last until spring. And she was not alone anymore. 12 families had hung quilts on their walls that fall. 12 families who had listened, learned, and put their faith in dead air and thermal physics. They burned through the winter months with firewood to spare their cabins warm, while their neighbors struggled their faith in the Swedish method, growing stronger with every comfortable day. The others watched, the skeptics, the holdouts, the ones who still believed that the old ways were the only ways. They burned their 10 cords and their 12 cords fed their fires around the clock, and wondered why the quilted cabins seemed so much warmer with so much less effort. By spring, half the settlement had committed to trying the technique. By the following winter, the number had doubled again. The change was spreading like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Each success created more believers. Each believer created more students. The mathematics of transformation working in Cora's favor for once. Caleb Morrison appeared in the spring of 1887. He came to the cabin on a May afternoon driving a wagon loaded with supplies for a homestead he was building on the far side of the creek. He was a man in his middle 30s with strong hands and quiet eyes and a way of listening that suggested he actually heard what people said. Mrs. Whitfield, he said, climbing down from his wagon, I've heard about your cabin, about what you did with the quilts. I was hoping you might show me. Cora studied him for a moment. She had shown dozens of people by now. Had repeated her explanation so many times that the words came automatically. But there was something different about this man. Something in the way he looked at her, not with the desperate hope of someone seeking salvation, but with the genuine curiosity of someone seeking understanding. Come inside, she said. She showed him everything. The quilts on the walls, the dead air spaces behind them, the airlock at the door. She explained the physics, drew the diagrams, answered the questions that every visitor asked. But Caleb Morrison asked different questions. He wanted to know how she had learned, who had taught her, What had made her believe something so different from everything else she had been told? He was interested not just in the technique, but in the journey that had led her to it. They talked for 3 hours. By the time he left, the sun was setting and Cora had told him things she hadn't told anyone. About Silas, about the grief, about the desperate mathematics of that first autumn when death had seemed inevitable. About Astrid and her pale eyes and her knowledge that no one wanted to hear. About Harriet and her spectacles and her predictions that had never come true. Caleb listened to all of it, and when he finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. "May I come back?" he asked. "I'd like to hear more." Cora found herself nodding before she had consciously decided to answer. "Yes," she said, "you may." He came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. The visits became a pattern, then a habit, then something that Cora found herself looking forward to with an anticipation that surprised her. Caleb Morrison was not like the other settlers who came to learn about quilted walls. He was interested in more than just the technique. He was interested in her. They talked about everything, about the land and the weather and the challenges of building something from nothing, about their pasts, their families, their reasons for coming to Kansas in the first place, about books and ideas and the small observations that made up a life. Caleb had been a school teacher back east, Cora learned. He had come to Kansas looking for something different, something that would test him in ways that standing in front of a classroom never could. He had lost a wife to cholera 3 years earlier and still carried that grief like a weight in his chest. They understood each other. They understood what it meant to have loved and lost, what it meant to rebuild a life from the wreckage of the old one, what it meant to face the prairie alone and refuse to be broken by it. The understanding grew into something more. Cora didn't name it at first, didn't want to name it. The memory of Silas was still fresh enough to make any new feelings seem like betrayal. But the heart she was learning did not follow rules. The heart opened when it was ready, not when permission was given. By summer, Caleb was coming to the cabin every day. By autumn, he was staying for dinner. By winter, Cora was counting the hours until his wagon appeared on the horizon. Astrid noticed. The old Swedish woman came to visit on a December afternoon, her pale eyes taking in the changes in Cora's cabin with the sharp attention of someone who missed nothing. The second chair pulled close to the fire, the extra cup hanging from its hook, the small signs of a life that was no longer being lived alone. The farmer Astrid said, the one who was a teacher. "Caleb, yes, he is good, he is good." Astrid nodded slowly, her weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. "You deserve good," she said. "After everything, you deserve someone who sees what you are." He does see. Cora felt heat rise to her cheeks, the kind of heat that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. He came to learn about the quilts, but he stayed for something else. "For you." "Yes." The old woman reached across the table and took Cora's hand. Her fingers were thin and cold, but her grip was strong. "Your husband," she said carefully. "He would not want you to be alone forever. He would want you to live, to be happy, to find whatever warmth you can in this cold world." Cora felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back. "I know," she whispered. "I know he would. Then don't be afraid." Astrid squeezed her hand. "The heart is like a cabin, Mrs. Whitfield. It can hold warmth even in the coldest winter, but only if you let someone in." The winter of 1887 to 88 was the warmest yet. Not in terms of temperature. The cold came as hard as it always did, sweeping down from the north with the relentless fury that Kansas winters were known for. But in terms of comfort, in terms of the peace that filled Cora's cabin, it was the warmest winter of her life. Caleb spent more time at her homestead than at his own. He helped with the chores, shared meals by the fire, talked long into the evenings about everything and nothing. The easy companionship of two people who had found each other against all odds. And the settlement continued to change around them. Half the homesteads had quilted walls now. Half the families were burning half the wood they once had, staying twice as warm, surviving winters that would have broken them before. The Swedish method, as people had taken to calling it, was becoming the standard way of doing things. Cora taught when asked, advised when consulted, helped when help was needed. She had become something she never expected to be. A teacher, a leader, a person whose knowledge mattered, all because she had listened to an old woman that everyone else ignored. Spring came early in 1888. The snow melted quickly, revealing a prairie that seemed eager to bloom. Green shoots pushed through the brown grass almost overnight. Birds returned from wherever birds went in winter. The whole world was waking up, stretching toward a sun that grew stronger each day. Cora rode out to Astrid's cabin on a March morning. She had been meaning to visit for weeks, but the business of spring had kept her occupied. There was planting to plan repairs to make all the endless work of preparing for another year on the prairie. But she had thought of Astrid, often had wondered how the old woman was weathering. The tail end of winter had felt a growing urge to see her that she couldn't quite explain. The cabin looked different when she arrived. Smaller somehow, quieter. The smoke rising from the chimney was thin and sparse, nothing like the steady plume that should have been there on a morning this cold. Cora climbed down from her wagon and walked to the door. She knocked. Once. Twice. No answer. She pushed the door open. Astrid was in bed. The old woman lay beneath a pile of quilts, her white hair spread across the pillow like a halo of snow. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow, her weathered face carrying a pallor that Cora recognized immediately. The pallor of someone who was dying. Astrid. Cora crossed the room in 3 quick strides, falling to her knees beside the bed. Astrid, can you hear me? The pale eyes opened slowly. They found Cora's face and focused with effort that seemed to cost something precious. Mrs. Whitfield. The voice was thin as paper. I was hoping you would come. How long have you been like this? Why didn't you send for me? A ghost of a smile crossed Astrid's lips. What would you have done, she asked. Stop the years from taking me? Turn back time? I could have been here. Cora took the old woman's hand. It was cold despite the quilts. Cold despite the fire that still burned in the stove. You shouldn't have to face this alone. I have faced everything alone for 20 years. Astrid's smile faded slightly. This is not so different. The cabin was warm around them. The quilts Astrid had hung on her own walls decades ago were still doing their work, still trapping the dead air that kept the cold at bay. The irony of it struck Cora like a blow. All this knowledge about keeping warm, and in the end, the cold came for everyone. Is there anything I can do? Cora asked. Anything at all? Astrid's hand tightened slightly around hers. Stay, she said. Just stay with me. That is enough. Cora stayed. She sent a word to Caleb asking him to manage things at her homestead. She built up the fire, made broth, did everything she could think of to make the old woman comfortable. But she knew even as she worked that comfort was all she could offer now. The end was coming, whether anyone was ready for it or not. They talked through the long hours. Astrid spoke of Sweden, of the home she had left behind so many years ago. She spoke of her husband, of the life they had built together before Kansas took him. She spoke of the decades since the loneliness and the persistence and the knowledge she had carried like a flame through all those years of darkness. And she spoke of Cora. You did what I could not, Astrid said on the second day. Her voice was weaker now, her breath coming harder. You made them listen. You showed them what I always knew was true. I only learned what you taught me. No. Astrid shook her head slightly. I taught you the knowledge. But the courage, the stubbornness, the refusal to give up, that was yours. I gave you the seed. You made it grow. Cora felt tears running down her cheeks. She didn't bother to wipe them away. What do I do when you're gone, she asked. Who teaches me then? You teach yourself. Astrid's pale eyes held hers with intensity that seemed impossible for someone so close to death. And you teach others. That is how knowledge survives. It passes from one hand to the next, one mind to the next, one generation to the next. You are the next hand now, Mrs. Whitfield. The knowledge belongs to you. The third day dawned gray and cold. Cora woke from a restless sleep in the chair beside Astrid's bed to find the old woman watching her. Those pale eyes, colorless as winter sky, seemed clearer than they had been in days. You were sleeping, Astrid said. Good. You will need your strength. For what? For everything that comes after. Astrid struggled to sit up slightly. Cora helped her, arranging pillows behind her back. There is something I must tell you, something I have never told anyone. What is it? Astrid was quiet for a long moment. Her eyes drifted to the quilted walls, to the cabin she had built and maintained alone for 2 decades. When I first came to this country, she said finally, I thought I was running away. From the memories, from the grief, from everything that reminded me of what I had lost. I thought if I went far enough the past could not follow. But it did. Yes. Astrid nodded slowly. It follows wherever you go. The people you loved, the things you lost, they become part of you. You cannot outrun yourself. Cora thought of Silas, of the grave on the prairie that she still visited when the seasons changed, of the ache that had faded but never entirely disappeared. What did you do? She asked. I stopped running. Astrid's voice grew softer. I stopped trying to escape the past and started trying to honor it. Every quilt I hung, every family I taught, every piece of knowledge I shared, it was my way of saying that what I learned mattered, that the people who taught me had not lived in vain. She reached out and took Cora's hand again. The cold is not the enemy, she said. The words came slowly now, each one an effort. It is a fact. Like the sun or the rain. You do not fight facts, you work with them. You find where the heat goes and you stop it there. You find where the cold comes from and you put something in its way. Still air, Cora whispered. Dead air, Astrid smiled. Air that does nothing. And in doing nothing does everything. Her grip tightened. You did good, Cora Whitfield. Better than I ever expected. Now you teach the others. Now you carry the knowledge forward. Now you become what I was. And someday someone will sit beside your bed and you will tell them what I am telling you. Her eyes closed. Her breathing slowed. And on a gray March morning in 1888, Astrid Lindgren passed from the world she had tried so hard to warm. They buried her on the hill behind her cabin. It was what she had wanted, she had told Cora in those final days. To rest on the land she had worked for 20 years beneath the skies she had watched for so long, surrounded by the prairie that had been her home in this strange new country so far from the fjords and forests of her birth. The whole settlement came to the funeral. Not out of obligation, not out of social expectation, but out of genuine respect for the woman who had taught them to survive. The woman they had once dismissed as a crazy foreigner was now mourned as a pioneer, a teacher, a keeper of knowledge that had saved countless lives. Reverend Bowen spoke the words over her grave. He did it properly, solemnly, without any hint of the condescension that had once colored his sermons about foreign ways and dangerous knowledge. Time and truth had changed him too, or at least taught him to keep his doubts to himself. Harriet stood at the back of the crowd. She said nothing, showed nothing, but she was there and her presence was its own kind of acknowledgement. A silent admission that the Swedish woman she had once dismissed had been right all along. When the service ended, people came to Cora one by one. They offered condolences. They shared memories of Astrid's teachings. They asked what would happen now, who would carry the knowledge forward, who would teach the next generation of settlers what they needed to know. Cora answered them all the same way. I will, she said. That's what she wanted. That's what I promised her. Caleb proposed on a summer evening in 1888. They were sitting on the porch of Cora's cabin, watching the sun set over the prairie, when he turned to her with an expression she had never seen before. Nervous, hopeful, vulnerable in a way that strong men rarely allowed themselves to be. I know it hasn't been long, he said. Since your husband. Since we met. I know people might talk, might say it's too soon, but I've learned something in my years on this earth, Cora. I've learned that time is not guaranteed to anyone. That the people who wait for the perfect moment often find that the moment never comes. He took her hand. I love you, he said. I love your strength and your stubbornness and your refusal to be what other people expect. I love the way you light up when you're teaching someone about dead air spaces. I love the way you still talk to your first husband's grave because it tells me you know how to love deeply and truly. I want to build a life with you, here, on this land, in this cabin that you saved with quilts and courage. Cora looked at the man in front of her, at his honest eyes, his steady hands, his heart that had been broken once and had healed enough to risk being broken again. She thought of Silas, of the love they had shared, the dreams they had built, the future they had planned before an axe slipped and everything changed. She thought of Astrid, of the old woman's words about letting someone in, about hearts that could hold warmth even in the coldest winter. She thought of herself, of the widow who had survived when everyone expected her to fail, of the woman who had learned that understanding was better than fighting, that working with reality was better than opposing it. Yes, she said, The word came out simple and clear, carrying all the weight of a future she was ready to embrace. Yes, I'll marry you. They married in the spring of 1889. The ceremony was held in the settlement church, the same church where Reverend Bowen had once preached about the dangers of foreign knowledge. The pews were filled with neighbors who had once whispered about the Whitfield widow, who had once bet against her survival, who had once waited for her to fail. Now they were celebrating her wedding. Cora wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself. Caleb wore his best suit, the one he had brought from back east, and saved for occasions that mattered. They stood before the altar and spoke the words that would bind their lives together, and the congregation bore witness to a union that nobody had expected. Harriet Bowen sat in the third row. She was older now, her steel-rimmed spectacles resting on a face that had softened with the years. She did not smile during the ceremony, did not offer congratulations afterward, did not give any outward sign that she had made peace with the woman she had once tried to destroy. But she was there, and her presence, like her silence years before, spoke volumes. They made their home in Cora's cabin, not Caleb's homestead across the creek, with its fresh-built walls and its empty rooms, but the cabin that Cora had saved, the one with quilts on every wall and dead air spaces that had kept her alive through the worst winter anyone could remember. It was right that they should live there. It was where the story had happened, where the knowledge had been put to the test, where a widow had refused to and a technique had been proven, and a whole settlement had learned to survive differently. They raised 5 children in that cabin, 3 boys and 2 girls born over the span of a decade, each one growing up in a home where the walls were quilted and the fire burned low, and the winter could not steal the warmth no matter how hard it tried. They learned to hang quilts before they learned to read. They understood dead air spaces before they understood arithmetic. The knowledge passed to them like mother's milk, as natural and essential as breathing. And Cora taught. Year after year, family after family, she spread the knowledge that Astrid had given her. She visited new homesteads and showed them how to prepare. She spoke at gatherings and explained the physics. She became what Astrid had been before her, a keeper of knowledge, a teacher, a woman whose wisdom could not be dismissed because it had been proven too many times. The settlement changed around her. New families arrived and learned the Swedish method before their first winter. Old families refined their techniques, adding improvements that Cora incorporated into her teachings. The quilted walls became standard practice as normal and expected as planting crops in spring or harvesting them in fall. And the fires burned low across the prairie. The years passed like seasons. Cora watched her children grow, watched them marry and have children of their own, watched the settlement expand into a town with proper streets and permanent buildings and all the trappings of civilization that had seemed so distant in those early years. She watched Harriet Bowen grow old and die carried off by pneumonia in the winter of 1902. The minister's wife was buried beside her husband in the cemetery behind the church, and Cora attended the funeral out of respect for the closure it represented. Whatever anger she had once felt toward Harriet had faded long ago, replaced by something closer to pity. Pity for a woman who had never been able to admit she was wrong, who had carried her pride to the grave because it was the only thing she had left. She watched the world change in ways she never could have imagined. Railroads came through, connecting the settlement to cities she had only heard of. Telephones appeared, carrying voices across distances that would have taken days to travel. Automobiles replaced horses, their engines growling where hooves had once clopped. But the winters stayed the same. The cold still came down from Canada. Every year still tried to steal the warmth from every cabin and every homestead on the prairie. And the quilted walls still stopped. It still trapped the dead air that kept the heat inside, still did the work that Astrid had taught and Cora had spread. Some things changed, some things didn't. The knowledge endured. Caleb died in the autumn of 1919. He went peacefully in the bed they had shared for 30 years, with Cora holding his hand and their children gathered around. The illness had come on slowly, giving them time to say the things that needed saying, to make the peace that needed making, to prepare for an ending that was sad but not tragic. "I had a good life," he told her near the end, "a better life than I ever expected. Because of you, because of us." Cora corrected him. "Because we found each other." He smiled, the same smile that had made her heart lift for 3 decades. "Because we found each other," he agreed. He closed his eyes. and Cora was alone again. Obey. But alone meant something different now. She had children who visited every week, grandchildren who filled the cabin with noise and laughter. A community that respected her, valued her, turned to her for wisdom in ways that still surprised her after all these years. She was the elder now, the keeper of the old knowledge as people had taken to calling it. The woman who remembered when the settlement was just a handful of homesteads scattered across the prairie, when survival meant burning through cord after cord of firewood, when a widow's chance of making it through winter alone was so slim that people simply assumed she would fail. She had proven them wrong. She had proven them all wrong. And now at 70 years old, she sat in the cabin she had saved and watched another generation learn the lessons she had taught. The cabin came down in the spring of 1923. Not because it had failed, not because the walls had crumbled or the roof had caved, but because her grandson Thomas and his new wife wanted to build something modern on the land, something with proper insulation and central heating and all the conveniences that the 20th century had to offer. Cora understood. She was too old to fight change and too wise to want to. The world moved forward whether you wanted it to or not. The only thing you could control was what you carried with you. So before the first wall came down, she went inside one final time. She walked through the rooms that had been her home for almost 40 years. She touched the quilts that still hung on the walls, though they were no longer needed now that the new house would have proper insulation. She remembered Silas, who had built these walls before his death. She remembered Astrid, who had taught her how to keep them warm. She remembered Caleb, who had shared them with her for 3 decades. She took down her grandmother's quilt, the flying geese pattern with its cascade of triangles moving across the fabric like birds in migration. The quilt that had hung on the north wall since that first November in 1885, when a desperate widow had gambled her life on knowledge that everyone said was foolishness. This one, she told Thomas, this one we keep. The quilt went to the Historical Society in 1935. Cora was 80 years old by then, living in the new house that Thomas had built, surrounded by family and comfort and all the things she had once fought so hard to achieve. She donated the quilt because she wanted the story to be remembered, wanted people to know what had happened here, what had been learned, what had been passed from one generation to the next. The display card read, "Dead air insulation technique brought to Kansas by Swedish immigrants in the mid-1800s." This quilt was used by widow Cora Whitfield in the winter of 1885 to 86 as part of a thermal insulation system that allowed her to survive on half the firewood typically required. The technique spread throughout the settlement and beyond, fundamentally changing how prairie homesteaders approached winter survival. It didn't mention Harriet Bowen or the mockery or the 9 cords of wood she had burned while Cora burned 4. It didn't mention the women's auxiliary meeting where they discussed Cora's situation or the widower in Dodge City who never got a letter. But the quilt remembered, the knowledge survived, and somewhere in Kansas there were probably still houses where the walls were hung with fabric, where dead air did the work, where people stayed warm by understanding the cold instead of fighting it. Cora Whitfield died in the winter of 1938. She was 83 years old, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren in a house that stayed warm without any effort at all. The technology had changed, but the principle remained. Still air, dead air, air that did nothing, and in doing nothing, did everything. They buried her next to Caleb on the hill overlooking the land she had saved. The headstone was simple, just her name, her dates, and a single line that her family had chosen because it captured something essential about who she had been. She understood the cold. Some stories end with the protagonist defeating the villain. This one ends with something warmer. A woman who refused to burn her way through winter, who learned that the air between things could matter more than the things themselves, who survived by doing less instead of more, by understanding instead of fighting, by working with reality instead of against it. She saved herself first. Then she saved everyone who would listen. And the knowledge she carried passed down from a Swedish grandmother to an immigrant widow to a Kansas homesteader to generations beyond. That knowledge still saves people today. Every insulated wall, every thermal barrier, every building that keeps its heat inside instead of letting it bleed away. They all owe something to a woman who hung quilts on her walls when everyone said it was foolishness. They all carry forward the legacy of dead air. The space between things, the gap that holds the warmth, the nothing that does everything.